I want you to imagine that you are holding a 7th century coin in the palm of your hand.
Okay.
Just a small piece of copper, right? It's weathered, it's, turned completely green with age. And usually when an archaeologist brushes the dirt off an artifact like this, the expectation is that it's going to, well, confirm the map that's already etched into our collective memory.
Right, yeah, like if you find a Roman coin in Italy, you expect to see Caesar's profile on it.
Exactly. It anchors the historical narrative. But the specific coin I want you to picture today does the exact opposite. If you look closely at the markings on this little piece of copper, it completely shatters everything traditionally understood about the geography, the origins, and really the earliest days of a major world empire.
Yeah, it's a profound historical disorientation, honestly.
It really is. I mean, this single artifact suggests that the map we have been using for over 1,000 years might just be entirely wrong.
Because when the physical evidence pulled straight from the ground openly contradicts the texts that were written centuries later, it forces a complete reevaluation of how an entire civilization was born.
And that is the massive puzzle we are putting together today on this deep dive. We are navigating, honestly, a groundbreaking and deeply detailed framework by Dr. Khaled Walid. It's titled The Levantine Revision, A New Geography of Early Islam.
Yeah, and Dr. Walid's premise here is staggering.
It really is. He argues that the foundational events of early Islam, they didn't actually occur in the vast deserts of the Hijaz down in the south of the Arabian Peninsula.
Right.
Instead, he systematically places the entire origin story right in the heart of the Levant. So the Fertile Crescent, spanning areas like modern-day Jordan, Palestine, Syria, and Lebanon.
Yeah, and I think it is so important to understand the sheer scale of what Dr. Walid is proposing here. I mean, relocating a history of this magnitude.
A history that's been geographically locked in place by tradition, theology, global geopolitics for, over a millennium?
Exactly. It requires dismantling the established narrative down to the studs. So he is looking at linguistics, he's looking at numismatics, which is the study of coins, and imperial historiography, to argue that an entire geographic reality was essentially erased and, rewritten.
Yeah. Now, real quick, because Walid's theory fundamentally remaps events and texts that are deeply, deeply significant to billions of people, and because it touches on ancient political nerves that, let's be honest, still vibrate through modern geopolitics, we have to set the ground rules for this conversation right up front.
Definitely.
Our job today on this deep dive is not to tell you whether Dr. Walid is historically right or wrong.
Right. We are not taking a side here.
No, not at all. And we are not endorsing these viewpoints through any kind of modern political lens, left or right. Our mission today is just to put on our archaeologist hats, look at the exact framework Dr. Walid has constructed, and figure out the mechanics of his argument.
Just impartially map out the staggering material and textual evidence he uses to try and pull off this historical revision.
Exactly. We're just looking at the blueprints he provided. So to understand the architecture of his argument, where do we start?
Well, we have to begin where Dr. Walid begins, which is with the dirt.
The dirt.
Yeah. This methodology relies heavily on what's called the neo-revisionist school of history. And that operates on a very strict principle. If you want to understand the 7th century, you cannot prioritize historical texts that were written down in the 9th or 10th centuries.
Because texts can be altered, right?
Exactly. You have to prioritize the contemporary material evidence, the artifacts produced at the exact time the events were unfolding. Texts can be edited, copied, manipulated by later empires to suit their needs. But a coin minted in the year 640 CE, that is frozen in time.
Which brings us directly back to that copper coin I had you picturing earlier. Now, the traditional history of this era tells us about the rapid expansion of a newly formed Islamic state, right? Bursting out of the Arabian desert with a fully formed, distinct theological identity.
Right, and eventually establishing the Umayyad dynasty.
Yeah, and the founder of that dynasty is Muawiyah. So logic dictates that Muawiyah's currency should reflect that new, distinct Islamic identity.
That is definitely the logical expectation. But Dr. Walid points out that the actual numismatic record, the coins themselves, tells a highly complicated story. When historians look at the early copper coins, which are known as fulus.
The fulus, okay.
Yeah, fulus. Minted under Muawiyah's rule in major Levantine cities like Damascus, Homs, and Tiberias, the iconography is entirely unexpected. According to Dr. Walid's analysis, these early coins depict Muawiyah standing, but he is prominently displayed alongside a Byzantine cross.
Wait, really? A Byzantine cross on the official currency of the first Umayyad ruler?
Yes.
I mean, that immediately short-circuits the traditional narrative. Why would a ruler who is projecting a new, distinct religion utilize the primary symbol of the Christian Byzantine Empire?
And it actually gets more complex than that. Dr. Walid notes that on these specific coins, Muawiyah's name isn't even inscribed in Arabic script.
What is it in?
It is inscribed in Greek, reading Muawiyah. Now, the coins do feature an Arabic element. They have the phrase Bismillah, meaning in the name of God. However, what is glaringly absent from this early currency is any mention of the phrase Muhammad is the messenger of God, or the full Islamic declaration of faith, the Shahada.
Oh, okay, let's break down the mechanics of that, because a coin isn't just money in the ancient world, right? It is mass media.
Absolutely. It's the ultimate propaganda tool.
Yeah, it's how a ruler communicates their legitimacy to the public. If you are a new conqueror bringing a brand new, distinct religion, you stamp your new symbols on the money to establish authority. But here we have Greek text, a Christian cross, and a fairly generic Arabic phrase for God.
Right.
What is Walid's explanation for this blended messaging?
So Dr. Walid uses this material evidence to introduce a critical concept in his framework, which he calls the proto-Islamic phase. He utilizes this Arabic theological term, barzakh.
Barzakh, what does that translate to?
It translates roughly to a barrier, a transitional phase, or a state of limbo. So Dr. Walid argues that the mid-7th century was not defined by a fully solidified Islamic state at all. Rather, it was a historical barzakh. It was a broad, inclusive, Abrahamic, monotheistic confederation.
Ah, okay. So the rigid borders we have today, where you are either in the Christian box, the Jewish box, or the Islamic box, those just didn't exist yet in the way we understand them today.
Exactly. Dr. Walid contends that before theological boundaries hardened in later centuries, the Levant was this very fluid environment. The ruling class was projecting a generalized monotheism that could appeal to everyone living under their administration.
But is it just the coins? Because, a skeptic listening might argue that maybe they just reused old Byzantine coin molds to save time, or maybe because the local merchants wouldn't accept unfamiliar money. Is there documentary evidence to support this idea of a broad, undefined monotheism?
Yeah, there is. Dr. Walid points to early papyrus records to corroborate the numismatic data. And one of the most significant is known as the PERF 558 papyrus.
Okay, what is that?
It was discovered in Egypt, and it's a bilingual tax receipt. It's written in both Greek and Arabic, and it's dated to roughly 643 CE.
Oh, so putting it right in the middle of this crucial era.
Exactly. And in this official state document, Muawiyah signs his name utilizing the title Abd Allah,
which translates to servant of God.
Right.
Now, in modern contexts, Abd Allah, or Abdullah, is a standard, ubiquitous Islamic name. Does Walid view it differently in the context of the year 643?
He views it entirely differently. I mean, in the context of later established Islamic history, it functions as an exclusive identifier. But Dr. Walid interprets Abd Allah through its immediate 7th century Levantine application.
Which means what, practically?
He argues it was utilized not as a strictly Islamic title, but as a diplomatic, inclusive royal umbrella term.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, it was meant to bridge the gap between Arab Christians, Jews, and this emerging proto-Islamic movement. It was a political mechanism, essentially, to unite a diverse monotheistic population under one administrative roof.
Man, this raises a massive structural question about who these rulers actually were. If Muawiyah and the early Umayyads are projecting this blended, Greek-speaking, cross-bearing, generic monotheism, it feels less like a hostile takeover by outsiders and more like a continuation of the local management.
Yes.
Like, think of a corporate buyout. If a massive conglomerate buys a beloved regional brand, they often keep the old logo on the storefront.
Right, and they keep the same manager at the desk.
Yeah, because they don't want to spook the customer base. Are the Umayyads just keeping the Byzantine logo, so to speak, to pacify the Levant?
That mechanism of continuity is exactly the foundation of Dr. Walid's argument regarding the Umayyads. He posits that they were not foreign, desert-dwelling conquerors who suddenly burst out of the southern sands to lay siege to the Byzantine and Sasanian empires.
Okay, so who were they?
Instead, Dr. Walid identifies the Umayyads as the direct successors, the continuation of a highly established pre-existing Arab power structure in the region, which was the Ghassanid kingdom.
Okay, we need to pause and establish the context here, because I feel like the Ghassanis are vital to Walid's puzzle, but they aren't typically front and center in high school history classes. Who exactly were the Ghassanids, and how did they function in the 7th century?
So the Ghassanids were a really powerful Arab kingdom, situated perfectly within the Levant. They covered parts of modern Syria, Jordan, and Palestine. Geopolitically, they operated as foederati.
Meaning treaty-bound allies?
Yes, treaty-bound allies and proxy forces for the Byzantine Empire. Their primary function was to guard the eastern frontiers of the Roman world against the rival superpower, the Sasanian Persian Empire, and their respective Arab proxies, the Lakhmids.
So they are essentially the Byzantine Empire's heavily armed buffer state. They're already militarized, they understand Roman administration, and they are fully integrated into Levantine geopolitics.
Exactly. But beyond their military and administrative sophistication, their religious identity is crucial to Dr. Walid's theory. The Ghassanis were monotheists, and specifically they were largely non-Trinitarian Christians.
Okay, meaning they believed in the God of Abraham and they revered Jesus, but they rejected the strict Byzantine Orthodox theology that defined the Trinity.
Right. They occupied a very unique theological middle ground.
Okay.
And this is the core of Dr. Walid's explanation for the rise of the Umayyad state. You see, in the early 7th century, the Byzantine and Sasanian empires fought a catastrophic, decades-long series of wars. It completely exhausted both superpowers. They drained their treasuries, they decimated their armies.
Just total burnout on both sides.
Total burnout. So when that dust settled, a massive power vacuum opened up in the Levant. And Dr. Walid argues that we shouldn't envision a sudden miraculous conquest from the southern desert filling that vacuum.
Right.
Rather, he sees the Ghassanid infrastructure, these highly trained, sophisticated, non-Trinitarian Arab monotheists who were already managing the region, simply stepping up and taking full control.
Okay, so the local managers executed a hostile takeover of the regional branch while the CEO was distracted.
Exactly.
And if you view the Umayyads as rebranded Ghassanids, the physical evidence suddenly aligns perfectly. Of course, Muawiyah's coins have Greek text and a cross. He is operating entirely within the visual, administrative, and cultural language that his people, Byzantine allied Arabs, had been utilizing for generations.
It creates a seamless continuity in the material record. There's no sudden rupture in the archaeology because there was no sudden influx of an entirely alien culture.
Wow. But, okay, if the physical evidence points firmly to a movement that was deeply embedded in the sophisticated Greek and Syriac-speaking world of the Levant, we run into a massive textual contradiction.
Right.
Because the foundational texts and traditions of this religion describe an unlettered prophet receiving a completely unprecedented revelation in a remote desert environment. How does Dr. Walid reconcile the traditional language of the text with this Levantine reality?
Well, Dr. Walid argues that the contradiction exists because we are fundamentally mistranslating the founding texts. He insists that if the geography shifts to the Levant, the terminology has to be re-examined through the linguistic environment of the Levant.
Which would be what, exactly?
Specifically, the interplay of Arabic, Syriac, and Greek. He argues we cannot view these words through the lens of 9th century scholars in Baghdad. We must view them through the lens of 7th century Levantine monotheists.
Okay, let's test that. Let's look at the most famous descriptive term applied to the prophet in the traditional narrative, which is Ummi.
Okay.
The standard universally accepted translation of Ummi is illiterate or unlettered. The traditional understanding is that this highlights the miraculous nature of the Quran, the idea that a man who physically could not read or write produced a text of unparalleled linguistic complexity. How does Dr. Walid deconstruct Ummi?
Dr. Walid offers a radical redefinition here. He argues that in the specific theological and linguistic melting pot of the Levant, the term Ummi had absolutely nothing to do with a person's physical ability to read or write.
Really? Then what does it mean?
Instead, he defines it as a term describing a community's scriptural and covenantal status.
Scriptural status. Okay, break down how that functioned.
In Dr. Walid's framework, Ummi people were a community that did not yet possess a fixed, divinely revealed heavenly book in their own native language. To illustrate this mechanism, Dr. Walid draws a direct parallel to the Hebrew concept of the Goyim.
The Gentiles, the nations outside the covenant.
Correct. The term Goyim didn't mean those nations were intellectually ignorant or literally unable to write. It meant they existed outside the specific scriptural covenant of the Torah. They did not have the book.
Ah, I see.
Dr. Walid applies this exact framework to the Arab monotheists of the Levant. They were surrounded by Byzantine Christians who possessed the gospel in Greek and Syriac. They were surrounded by Jewish communities who possessed the Torah in Hebrew.
But these Arab believers, groups like the Ghassanids, they were scripturally disenfranchised.
Exactly. They had no divine text codified in Arabic. They were the Ummi, the Gentile monotheists, waiting for their own revelation.
That reframes the entire sociology of the early movement. It isn't a story about basic literacy at all. It is a story about a community seeking theological parity with the massive empire surrounding them. What textual evidence does Walid use to support this specific definition?
He anchors this definition directly in the text of the Quran itself. Dr. Walid points to Surah 42, verse 52, which translates to, "You did not know what the book or what faith was."
Traditionally, that is read as a statement of prior ignorance.
Right, but Dr. Walid reads it as a precise description of the Ummi condition. It describes a community living in a theological patchwork, relying on human interpretations of older scriptures, actively waiting for a unifying, definitive revelation to arrive and codify their faith.
If the Ummi are a community waiting for an architect to give them a blueprint, who actually delivers it? This leads to one of Dr. Walid's most provocative linguistic arguments, I think. He essentially splits the primary titles of the Prophet, Ahmad, and Muhammad into two distinct phases. Traditionally, these are treated as synonymous, just interchangeable names for the exact same historical figure. But Dr. Walid approaches them as a sequence of events, right?
Yes, he views Ahmad and Muhammad not merely as names, but as titles representing an evolution of spiritual authority and the progression of the revelation itself. According to Dr. Walid's theory, the title Ahmad represents the pre-revelation phase of the messenger.
What does that phase look like practically on the ground in the Levant?
Well, in Dr. Walid's model, Ahmad is the figure actively operating within that broad proto-Islamic barzakh we discussed earlier.
The transitional phase.
Exactly. This figure is deeply exposed to the established scriptures of the region, the Torah and the Gospel, and is preaching a unified Abrahamic monotheism to the Ummi Arabs. However, during the Ahmad phase, this figure has not yet received or finalized the complete independent Arabic text.
So the architect is drafting the plans, studying the older buildings around him, but the final blueprint isn't finished. Then what is the trigger that transitions the title to Muhammad?
The transition to the title Muhammad occurs upon the completion and finalization of that revelation process. Muhammad is the state of being, the achieved title. When the Quran is whole, the message is finalized, and the Ummi people are no longer scripturally disenfranchised.
Wow. Walid isn't just redefining a name, he is defining the life cycle of a religious movement. The Ahmad phase is the struggle, the synthesis of Levantine monotheism, and the Muhammad phase is the culmination. And Walid ties the linguistic root of these titles back to a very specific prophecy in the Christian texts of the Levant, doesn't he?
He does, and it firmly roots his linguistic analysis in the Byzantine environment. He examines the Gospel of John, specifically the prophecy of the Paraclete.
Okay, unpack the Paraclete.
Theologians have debated this term for centuries. Christian tradition generally identifies the Paraclete as the Holy Spirit, while Islamic scholars have historically argued it was a prophecy foretelling the Prophet of Islam.
Right.
Dr. Walid steps outside the theological debate entirely and looks at it purely through the lens of linguistics and translation.
How does he connect a Greek gospel concept to an Arabic title?
He focuses on a phonetic and semantic link. A Greek term, often associated with the underlying concept of the Paraclete prophecy, is parakletos.
Paraslutos, which translates to what?
It roughly translates to the highly praised one. And Dr. Walid points out that this Greek concept maps immaculately onto the Arabic consonantal root, HMD.
The root of both Ahmad and Muhammad, which also translates to highly praised.
Precisely. Dr. Walid's argument is that in this Levantine melting pot, where Greek, Syriac, and Arabic are constantly interacting, the scripturally disenfranchised Ummi community was anticipating the arrival of the Parakletos.
We're looking for the highly praised one promised in the older text.
Yeah, exactly. When that figure emerges and completes the revelation, he embodies the direct Arabic translation of that very concept, Muhammad. Dr. Walid argues that the foundational titles of the movement did not develop in an isolated linguistic vacuum in the desert. They were a direct, calculated translation of the theological expectations of the Byzantine Levant.
Okay, hold on. If the material evidence, the coins, the Greek texts, the papyri, and the linguistic evidence, the true meaning of Ummi, the progression of Ahmad to Muhammad, the translation of Parakletos, if all of this firmly anchors the origins of this movement in the Levant, we hit a massive geographic brick wall.
We do.
Because the traditional story we all know is not set in the Levant. It is set hundreds of miles to the south, in the Hijaz, in the cities of Mecca and Medina. How does Walid reconcile this glaring geographic contradiction?
Well, he doesn't reconcile it. He completely dismantles it.
Yeah.
Dr. Walid argues that we've been looking at the wrong map entirely.
The wrong map.
Yes. He posits that the geography of the traditional narrative is a later projection, To fix the map, Dr. Walid asserts that we must fundamentally separate two concepts that traditional historiography has treated as identical for centuries: Mecca and Bakkah.
Okay, yeah. In the standard understanding, Bakkah is simply an older, ancient, or alternate pronunciation for Mecca. They're the exact same location in the Hijaz, the site of the Kaaba. Walid splits them into two entirely different cities.
Yes, completely different cities.
Let's start with Mecca. If Dr. Walid claims Mecca is not the city in the Southern Desert, where does he locate the Mecca described in the early texts?
Based on his cross-referencing of textual descriptions and physical topography, Dr. Walid identifies the Mecca of the Quran with the ancient city of Petra, located in southern Jordan.
Petra, the monumental city carved directly into the rose-red cliffs. I mean, it is a massive archaeological site. But you cannot simply point at a famous ancient city and declare it the lost Mecca. What is the specific mechanism of his proof here? How does Petra fit the criteria better than the actual city of Mecca in the Hijaz?
Well, Dr. Walid argues that the physical descriptions provided in the Quran simply do not match the historical and archaeological reality of the Hijazi Mecca, but they align perfectly with Petra. He notes that the Quran frequently describes a city characterized by ruins, a place that suffered destruction or abandonment. It specifically mentions abandoned wells, which ties into the early traditions surrounding the well of Zamzam. And most crucially, the texts describe a city of lofty, elaborate palaces and structures carved directly out of the mountains.
Right, and the Hijaz is characterized by flat, arid basins and rocky valleys, but historically it did not feature monumental carved stone architecture in the pre-Islamic era.
Correct. Petra, however, is the literal embodiment of a ruined city with massive, elaborate structures hewn directly into the rock face, like the iconic Qasr al-Bint, the great Nabatean temple.
Right, the one everyone knows from the photos.
Exactly. In Dr. Walid's framework, Petra serves as the cosmopolitan center for the rival powers of the era: the Sasanian Persians, their Arab Lakhmid allies, and various Israelite communities. He identifies this Petra Mecca as the forbidden house, or the prevented house in his terminology, the seat of the adversarial forces.
If Mecca is Petra in Jordan, representing the stronghold of the Sasanian influence, then what does Dr. Walid identify as Bakkah?
Bakkah, in Dr. Walid's newly drawn map, is Jerusalem. Jerusalem is Bakkah. Wow. That completely reorients the spiritual gravity of the entire narrative.
Yes, it does. If Petra was the center of Sasanian and Lakhmid power, Dr. Walid argues that Jerusalem was the ultimate spiritual and political prize for the Ghassanids and their monotheistic allies. He identifies Jerusalem as the true sacred house and the actual site of the farthest mosque referenced in the Nocturnal Journey. It is the geographic and spiritual heart of the Ahmad movement.
Remapping a skirmish is one thing, but relocating the two holiest concepts in the early narrative, moving Mecca to Petra and Bakkah to Jerusalem, placing them directly on the fault line between the Roman and Persian empires, that is an astronomical claim.
It really is.
If Dr. Walid is right, how is it possible that this happening entirely in the Levant wasn't recorded by anyone else? Where's the external proof? Are there any sources from outside the Islamic tradition that place these foundational events in Palestine and Jordan instead of the deep desert? This is actually a cornerstone of Dr. Walid's argument. He relies heavily on extrapolation from non-Islamic contemporary sources. He points to several 7th and 8th century Syriac and Armenian chronicles.
What are those exactly?
These were texts compiled by Christian monks, bishops, and historians who were living in the Levant at the exact time these events were unfolding. They were eyewitnesses to the geopolitical shifts.
And what do these specific eyewitnesses write about the origins of this movement?
Two of the most critical texts Dr. Walid cites are the writings of Thomas the Presbyter, recorded around 640 CE, which is astonishingly early.
Yeah, that's right in the middle of it.
And the Chronicle of Zukin, compiled later but relying on earlier contemporary accounts. When these chroniclers document the emergence of Muhammad and his early followers, they explicitly and repeatedly locate them operating among the Saracens in southern Palestine and the surrounding Levantine regions.
They locate the movement in southern Palestine, not the Hijaz.
That is Dr. Walid's critical point. In these early external accounts, there is absolutely no mention of the Hijaz Desert. There is no mention of Mecca or Medina as distant southern epicenters. The Byzantine and Syriac observers living through this era perceived and recorded this movement as something emerging from and operating entirely within their own Levantine backyard.
Okay, but this creates a massive logistical puzzle. If Mecca is Petra and Bakkah is Jerusalem, and all the contemporary Syriac monks say the action took place in Palestine, How does Dr. Walid explain the legendary early battles?
Right.
I mean, Badr, Uhud, the Battle of the Trench. These are the defining military engagements of the narrative. You cannot march an army from Jerusalem down to Medina for a weekend skirmish. The geography simply doesn't allow for the traditional timeline.
That logical consequence brings us to probably the most intricate part of Dr. Walid's study. He recognizes that if you move the map, the traditional timeline completely shatters. Therefore, he has constructed a meticulous, highly detailed chronological chart that realigns the entire sequence of events, integrating the micro-history of the Prophet's movement into the macro-history of the massive Byzantine-Sasanian wars.
Okay, let's walk through the mechanics of this timeline because he provides very specific dates. How does he frame the lifespan and the mission?
Dr. Walid's visual timeline charts the Prophet's life as spanning 73 years, from 571 to 644 CE. He defines a total period of the active mission as lasting 32 years, stretching from 612 to 644 CE.
And what is the anchor point? When you are shifting a historical timeline, you need an undeniable global event to tether everything to. What is Walid's anchor?
The anchor is a devastating world historical event, the Sasanian-Persian takeover of Jerusalem, which, remember, Dr. Walid identifies as Bakkah. This conquest occurred in 614 CE.
The Persians capture the spiritual center in 614 CE.
Yes. And according to Dr. Walid's chart, this Sasanian occupation of Jerusalem lasted for 13 brutal years, from 614 to 627 CE. In his framework, everything about the early movement revolves around this occupation. The mission is born in the shadow of this imperial conquest.
How does that map onto the early years of the mission?
He notes that the secret call of the mission occurs for 2 years, from 612 to 614, right as the Byzantine defenses are collapsing, ending exactly when the Romans are defeated and the Sasanians seize the city.
That dramatically alters the stakes of the movement. It is no longer a localized tribal dispute in a desert oasis. It is an active resistance movement reacting to the Persian occupation of their holiest city. Let's test this timeline against the famous battles. Take the Battle of Badr. Traditionally, that is in 624 CE, a clash between Meccan and Medinan forces. How does Walid remap Badr?
Dr. Walid uses a combination of linguistic markers and Levantine geography to relocate Badr. On his revised timeline, this first major engagement occurs in 623 CE. He maps the location to a region historically known as Badora, which is situated west of the Dead Sea in the Levant.
Badora? I mean, the linguistic parallel is obvious. But who is fighting? If it isn't rival Hijazi clans, who is engaging at Badora?
In Dr. Walid's model, this is a clash between the Ghassanid-aligned monotheists, the followers of the Ahmad movement, and the Lakhmid Arab forces who are allied with the occupying Sasanian Persians. It is a critical proxy battle in the much larger imperial war for control of the Levant.
Okay, what about the Battle of Uhud? Traditionally, this takes place near a mountain outside Medina, and it is a devastating setback for the early believers.
Dr. Walid places this battle the following year, in 624 CE. He maps Uhud to a region called Ehud. This is a location with deep historical and Jewish associations, positioned in the Jordan and Palestine territory. Once again, he takes a battle traditionally isolated in the southern desert and drops it directly into the contested, highly strategic topography of the Levant.
Now we come to what is arguably the most famous defensive engagement, the Battle of the Trench, or the Azab.
Yes.
Traditionally, this involves a massive confederation of enemies laying siege to the city of Medina, prompting the defenders to dig a massive trench. How on earth does Walid move a massive trench warfare siege to the Levant?
This is where Dr. Walid's topographical analysis is at its most compelling, I think. In his timeline, the Azab occurs in 632 CE, but his primary argument revolves around the physical impossibility of the traditional narrative.
Impossibility how?
Well, the Quran famously describes the terror of this battle by stating the attackers came from above you and from below you. Dr. Walid points out a glaring geographical issue. Medina is situated in a relatively flat desert basin.
Right. You can't have an attack coming from varying elevations if you are fighting on a flat plain.
Exactly. It is practically impossible to execute a multi-dimensional, multi-elevation siege in that topography. However, if you apply that exact Quranic description to Jerusalem.
If Bakkah is Jerusalem.
Jerusalem is a city entirely defined by extreme vertical topography. It is built on high ridges, heavily fortified, and completely surrounded by deep, plunging ravines like the Kidron Valley and the Valley of Hinnom. It is also riddled with ancient underground water shafts and tunnels.
Wow.
Yeah. In the context of ancient warfare, an attack on Jerusalem literally and terrifyingly comes from the ridges above and from the ravines and tunnels below. Dr. Walid argues that the Battle of the Trench was, in reality, a massive, desperate siege of Jerusalem by a confederation of Sasanian and Lakhmid forces attempting to break the city's defenses.
That topographical explanation provides a brilliant mechanism for understanding the text. From above and from below isn't a metaphor, it's a literal description of siege warfare in the ravines of Jerusalem. Where does he place the Battle of Hunain, then?
Hunain is placed in 625 CE on his chart, and he locates it geographically north of Jerusalem, maintaining the pattern of engagements moving through the Levantine corridor.
This all builds to the ultimate climax of the early narrative, which is the conquest of Mecca, the triumphant return. But if Mecca is Petra and Bakkah is Jerusalem, what exactly is being conquered and from whom?
In Dr. Walid's timeline, the monumental conquest takes place in 627 CE, but it is not a march on the Hijaz. He argues that this event was, in historical reality, the liberation of Bakkah, the liberation of Jerusalem, from the devastating 13-year occupation by the Sasanian and Lakhmid forces.
The ultimate victory is taking back Jerusalem from the Persians.
Yes, and crucially, Dr. Walid posits that this liberation was not achieved in isolation. It coincided with and was supported by the massive historic counteroffensive launched by the Byzantine Emperor Heraclius, who was simultaneously sweeping through the region to break the Sasanian grip on the Levant.
The implications of this timeline are just staggering. Dr. Walid has effectively taken the foundational narrative of Islam, removed it from the isolation of the desert, and seamlessly woven it into the absolute center of the greatest geopolitical conflict of late antiquity. The movement isn't a side story, it is the beating heart of the Roman-Persian World War.
Exactly.
But, this structural shift demands we ask a very difficult question about the cast of characters. If these battles were actually Byzantine-Sasanian proxy conflicts fought in the Levant, who were the legendary figures leading the charge?
You are referring to the companions, the iconic heroes, generals, and political leaders of the early movement who are universally depicted in later histories as desert warriors. Dr. Walid argues that if you deconstruct their names, they reveal the true Levantine origins of the movement.
Let's test this etymological analysis. Who is the undisputed, most famous military commander of this era? It is Khalid ibn al-Walid, known as the Sword of God, an undefeated tactical genius. If Khalid wasn't a Meccan cavalry commander, how does Dr. Walid explain his existence?
Dr. Walid analyzes the root meanings of these names, hypothesizing that they are not personal Bedouin names at all. Instead, he argues they are Arabized translations of highly specific Syriac, Greek, and Nabatean military and administrative titles.
So not names, but titles.
Exactly. He begins with Khalid. In Arabic, Khalid translates to immortal or eternal. Dr. Walid then looks at Byzantine military context of the Levant. In that culture, the ultimate symbol of immortal, undefeatable martial strength was the Greek hero Hercules.
The archetype of invincibility?
Yes. And the Greek honorific derived from Hercules is Herakleios. In the Byzantine military apparatus, this was a common title denoting immense tactical prowess and invincibility, an immortal warrior. Dr. Walid argues that the name Khalid is simply the localized Arabic translation of that Greek military title, Herakleios.
Wow.
Therefore, the figure of Khalid ibn al-Walid does not represent a singular man from the desert. The name represents a Byzantine allied Arab commander operating within a localized Ghassanid version of the Heraclean military system.
That is a fundamental shift in how we view historical records. Khalid wasn't his birth name, it was his job description. He was the Heraclius of his unit. How does Walid apply this to the political figures? What about Abu Bakr, the first caliph, the foundational political leader after the prophet?
For Abu Bakr, Dr. Walid turns to Syriac, which functioned as the lingua franca for the Christian and monotheist communities of the Levant. He links the Arabic Bakr directly to the Syriac administrative term Bakuda.
What is the mechanical function of the title Bakuda?
The term Bakuda carries meanings related to being the firstborn, or in a hierarchical sense, the first to believe, or the first in authority. In Dr. Walid's framework, Abu Bakr is an Arabized iteration of a Syriac ecclesiastical or administrative title denoting the primal leader, the foremost authority within the newly formed community.
Let's look at one more major figure, Umar, the second caliph, legendary for his imposing strength and strict justice.
Dr. Walid traces the etymology of Umar back to a very specific Greek concept, ambrosios.
Ambrosia, the food of the gods, meaning immortality.
Yes. Ambrosios denotes immortality, divine favor, or possessing God-given vitality and authority. It was utilized as an honorific in the Byzantine sphere to denote a leader endowed with immense, divinely sanctioned strength. Dr. Walid posits that Umar is the Arabic phonetic and semantic equivalent of that Greek honorific ambrosial.
Okay, I have to challenge this premise because the implications are sort of unsettling. If Dr. Walid is systematically deconstructing the names of the most revered figures in early Islamic history and turning them into Greek and Syriac job titles, is he arguing that these people simply did not exist? Are Abu Bakr, Umar, and Khalid just historical phantoms conjured out of Byzantine dictionaries by later writers?
No, and that is a vital distinction in Dr. Walid's work. He is not claiming these figures are mythical. He is arguing that they were very real historical commanders, administrators, and leaders who operated within a highly complex, multilingual Ghassanid and Levantine coalition.
Okay, so they were real people.
Yes, they existed and they fought these wars. But during their lifetimes, they were known and addressed by their imperial Levantine ranks and titles.
So the commander who led the charge against the Persians existed, but he introduced himself to his troops by his rank, his Heraclius title, which in Arabic was Khalid. How, then, do these titles become literal names in the history books?
Dr. Walid attributes this to a phenomenon we can call linguistic fossilization. You have to consider the mechanics of history here. These events occurred in the early 7th century. But the definitive canonical histories of these events, the texts we read today, they were not codified and written down until the 9th and 10th centuries.
Right.
Primarily by Abbasid scholars working in Iraq, hundreds of miles away and hundreds of years later. Over decades of oral transmission, the original multilingual context of these Levantine titles degraded. By the time an Abbasid scribe in Baghdad wrote down the oral traditions, the imperial Levantine ranks had fossilized.
The telephone game.
Exactly. The scribe heard the Arabic translation of a Syriac title for first believer and simply assumed he was a Bedouin man's first name. Abu Bakr. The multicultural imperial reality of the Levantine army vanished entirely into the text.
It is the ultimate historical game of telephone. But this brings us to the climax of Walid's framework. Because if you accept this theory, if titles were transformed into names, if the timeline was shifted by decades, and if the entire geographic setting of Mecca and Bakkah was moved from the Levant to the Hijaz, you have to recognize that an erasure of this magnitude cannot happen by accident.
Right, definitely not.
A scribe misunderstanding a name is an accident. Relocating a holy city is a conspiracy. Dr. Walid outlines a grand theory of how and why this entire Levantine history was deliberately covered up by successive empires.
Yes, Dr. Walid argues that the current map is a result of a deliberate, systematic rewriting of history designed to serve imperial power. But before he dissects the specific empires, he points out that the clues to this recurring cycle of corruption are actually encoded in the cosmic mythology of the Quran itself. He reinterprets the ancient parables as geopolitical warnings.
How does he interpret the figures of Gog and Magog? Because traditionally they are viewed as apocalyptic hordes that will emerge at the end of the world to cause chaos.
Dr. Walid strips away the apocalyptic monster imagery and reads them as political archetypes. In his framework, Gog represents the archetype of corrupt, religious, and political authority.
Like the weaponization of faith.
Yes, the deliberate weaponization and distortion of faith to control populations. Magog represents raw, brutal, militarized, and financial might. Together, Gog and Magog symbolize the recurring imperial forces, like the Sasanians or later empires, that constantly seek to surround, corrupt, and destroy the true spiritual center of Bakkah.
He also reinterprets the oldest story in the Abrahamic tradition, doesn't he? The story of Cain and Abel, two brothers resulting in the first murder. How does a story about ancient fratricide map onto 7th century geopolitics?
For Dr. Walid, Cain and Abel serve as the foundational metaphor for the unending trauma of the Levant. Abel represents the pure agrarian monotheist, the legitimate spiritual heir deeply rooted in the sanctity of Jerusalem. Cain, the wanderer, represents the corrupted militarized nomad.
Whoa.
And crucially, Cain is the archetype of the local force that forms alliances with massive external powers, just as the Arab Lakhmids allied with the Sasanian Persians to attack his brother and seize the Holy Land by force. Dr. Walid argues that the entire history of the region is the story of Cain constantly reinventing himself to usurp Abel's spiritual inheritance.
It is a profound and incredibly dark view of history. It suggests the conflict is cyclical and unending. So if this is the pattern, who executed the cover-up? Who played the role of Cain and rewrote the map?
Dr. Walid outlines a precise four-stage imperial cover-up. It is a timeline of how geography was manipulated over 1,200 years. Phase 1 begins with the Abbasid Caliphate.
The Abbasids, ruling from their newly constructed capital of Baghdad in the 8th and 9th centuries, These are the rulers who sponsored the golden age of Islamic scholarship, and crucially, they are the ones who commissioned the writing of the histories we rely on today.
Precisely. To understand their motive, you have to look at how they came to power. The Abbasids violently overthrew the Umayyad dynasty. The Umayyads' power base, their historical and political legitimacy, was entirely rooted in the Levant, in cities like Damascus and Jerusalem. Dr. Walid argues that to solidify their new regime, the Abbasids needed to completely sever the religion's foundational origins from the Umayyad stronghold. They needed to delegitimize the Levant.
How do you practically achieve that? You can't just tell people their holy city is somewhere else.
You do it through a massive state-sponsored historiographical project. The Abbasids controlled the scholars, the texts, and the narrative. Dr. Walid argues they systematically relocated the concept of Mecca to the remote, geographically isolated Hijaz desert.
Just completely moved it.
Yes. By moving the origin story, the birthplace of the prophet, the site of the revelations, to a neutral location deep in the desert, they stripped the Levant of its foundational sanctity. They bypassed Umayyad history entirely, centralizing their own authority in Iraq while directing spiritual attention south to a desert that posed no political threat to their rule.
It is a masterclass in geopolitical spin. They effectively said, the true Holy Land isn't where our defeated enemies live, it's down in this harsh desert where no rival empire can easily challenge the narrative. That establishes the false map. What is Phase 2?
Phase 2 is the Ottoman phase, centered in Istanbul centuries later. The Ottoman Empire conquered the Middle East, including the Levant and the Hijaz, but they ruled this vast territory from afar in Europe and Anatolia.
Did the Ottomans know the map was altered, according to Walid?
Dr. Walid argues that the Ottomans maintained and aggressively protected the Abbasid geographical fiction because it perfectly served their imperial interests. The mechanism of control was guardianship. By claiming the title of custodians of the holy mosques in the Hijaz, the Ottoman sultans controlled the global Muslim population spiritually.
But they kept the actual power elsewhere.
Exactly. By keeping the Holy Land in the remote desert, they kept the actual volatile geopolitical power firmly centralized in Istanbul, far away from the true historical epicenter of Jerusalem. They utilized the spiritual prestige of the Hijaz to avoid dealing with the political reality of the Levant.
Keep the spiritual clout, but outsource the location to avoid the political mess. That brings us to the modern era. What is Phase 3?
Phase 3 is the British phase, orchestrated from London in the early 20th century. This phase centers entirely on the engineering of the modern Middle East following the collapse of the Ottoman Empire after World War I. Dr. Walid points specifically to the Sykes-Picot Agreement and the subsequent mandate system.
Right, drawing lines on a map.
Yes. He contends that the British and French colonial powers deliberately drew the borders of the modern Middle East in a way that actively protected the ancient geographical deception. By fragmenting the Levant and isolating the Arabian Peninsula, they ensured the region remained divided, ultimately facilitating the handover of control of the true Bakkah, Jerusalem, while keeping the spiritual distraction of the Hijaz intact.
Which leads inevitably to Phase 4, the era we are currently living in.
Yes, the American phase, directed from Washington. In Dr. Walid's framework, this represents the contemporary architecture of geopolitical control. He argues that modern global superpowers maintain dominance by exploiting the dual centers created by this historical cover-up.
Dual centers.
Yes, on one hand, they engage with a functional Mecca in the Gulf, the center of global energy and financial wealth, which relies on the protected geography of the Hijaz. On the other hand, they manage the true spiritual center of Bakkah, Jerusalem, which remains a heavily controlled focal point of intense, perpetual conflict.
Yeah.
By keeping the spiritual and financial power bases divided across a false geography, modern empires maintain ultimate leverage over the entire region.
The scope of that theory is just dizzying. I mean, he connects a 9th century scribe in Baghdad directly to 20th century border treaties and modern superpower diplomacy. But there is one final, incredibly specific historical detail in Walid's analysis regarding the Ottomans. He calls it the tale of two Mohammeds. It is a linguistic rhyme that he claims proves the deliberate nature of this geographic shift. How does this work?
It is a really fascinating piece of linguistic and historical mirroring. Dr. Walid looks at the Arabic designation for Constantinople, the capital is the Byzantine Empire. The Arabic name is Questnen. Dr. Walid breaks this down etymologically to mean the land of justice and light.
Okay, Constantinople is the land of justice and light.
Dr. Walid argues that Constantinople was conceptually set up by the Ottomans as the ultimate political mirror to Jerusalem. If Jerusalem, Bakkah, was the original spiritual light of the world, Constantinople was the ultimate imperial political light. Now, observe the timeline. In Dr. Walid's remapped history, Muhammad the Prophet, the first Muhammad, conquered and liberated Jerusalem, the spiritual center, in 627 CE.
The triumph of the spiritual realm.
Exactly. Fast forward roughly 800 years to 1453 CE. The Ottoman Sultan Mehmed the Conqueror, whose name in Arabic is Muhammad al-Fatih, captures Constantinople, the political center.
Muhammad I takes the spiritual city. Muhammad II takes the political city.
Yes. Dr. Walid argues that the Ottoman Empire actively recognized and utilized this incredible historical parallel to permanently cement their political narrative. By conquering the land of justice and light, the Ottomans claimed they were fulfilling the ultimate imperial destiny.
They replaced the original victory with their own.
Precisely. They positioned Muhammad II's political conquest of Constantinople as the culmination of history, effectively overshadowing, ignoring, and sidelining Muhammad I's original spiritual conquest of Jerusalem. The political triumph in Turkey finalized the erasure of the spiritual origins in the Levant.
It is as if history folded back in on itself to hide the evidence. We have traversed an immense landscape today, dissecting the architecture of Dr. Khaled Walid's Levantine Revision. We started by looking at the dirt, the early fulus coins minted by Muawiyah, adorned with Byzantine crosses and Greek text, which Walid argues proves the existence of a fluid, proto-Islamic monotheism led by the Ghassanid Arabs.
We examined the mechanics of translation, exploring how a Levantine context redefines the term Ummi from illiterate to scripturally disenfranchised, and how the titles Ahmad and Muhammad represent phases of revelation, directly translating the Greek Christian concept of the Parakletos.
We watched the map fundamentally shift, separating Mecca and Bakkah, identifying Petra as the ruined Sasanian stronghold, and Jerusalem as the true sacred house, a geography supported by the external, contemporary accounts of Syriac and Armenian chroniclers.
And we traced Dr. Walid's meticulous 73-year timeline, anchoring the narrative to the 614 CE Sasanian invasion, transforming famous desert skirmishes like the Battle of the Trench into harrowing topographical sieges within the ravines of Jerusalem. We unpacked the linguistic fossilization that turned Byzantine and Syriac military titles like Heraklios and Ambrosios into the personal names of legendary commanders like Khalid and Umar.
And finally, we mapped the grand 1,200-year imperial cover-up. From the Abbasids manipulating text to sever the Umayyad connection, to the Ottomans guarding a geographical fiction, down to the modern treaties that keep the true Bakkah perpetually contested while managing the financial centers of the Gulf. You know, we often consume history as though it is a fixed, solid object, a series of undeniable facts printed in a textbook immune to alteration. But Dr. Walid's framework is a stark reminder of the mechanics of power. History is not merely what happened. History is the narrative the victors commission scribes to write down. It is the specific definitions they choose when translating ancient languages. It is the literal maps they physically draw, enforce, and hand down for future generations to blindly inherit.
Which leads to a profound, lingering question drawn directly from the methodology of Dr. Walid's study. His framework suggests that the geographic memory, the linguistic origins, and the foundational reality of millions of people could be profoundly and successfully rewritten by ancient empires, utilizing nothing more than parchment, shifting pilgrimage routes, and the control of oral tradition.
Right.
If a deception of that magnitude could be engineered in the 9th century, consider the tools available today. In our modern era, characterized by digital archives that can be altered in a keystroke, the proliferation of deepfakes, and algorithmic information control, how easily could today's global powers be quietly relocating or entirely rewriting the geographical and historical map of our own era, crafting a perfectly engineered illusion for the generations of the future to inherit as undeniable truth?
Next time you look at a map or read a history book, I want you to imagine that weathered 7th century coin in your hand. The Byzantine cross, the Greek letters. It is small, but the weight of it is immense. It is a physical reminder that the solid ground we stand on, the history upon which we build our geopolitical reality, might simply be a map drawn by someone else, pointing us exactly where they need us to look. Until next time, keep digging.